The gentle steel. The setting sun painted the Montana sky like spilled whiskey on a saloon floor, amber and gold bleeding into deep purple shadows that crept across the Bitterroot Valley. Jake Hawkins sat atop his paint horse, weathered hands resting easy on worn leather reins, watching as the last light caught the silver cross hanging from Mary Bennett's throat. The same cross that had caught his eye 6 months ago, when he'd first ridden into Copper Creek with nothing but 2 pistols, a reputation, and a promise to keep. "You ain't gotta do this, Jake," Mary said, her voice soft as prairie grass in the evening breeze. "There's always another way." Jake's hands that could break a wild Mustang or cradle a newborn lamb, tightened almost imperceptibly on the reins. Those same hands had dealt death more times than he cared to count, but they'd never lost their gentleness. His pa used to say a real cowboy's hands were like good steel wrapped in leather, strong enough to rope a steer, gentle enough to handle spring wildflowers. "Some things a man's gotta face head-on," he replied, eyes fixed on the approaching dust cloud that marked Tucker Kane's gang riding hard toward town. "Like a rattler in your path, ain't no going around it." Mary's fingers brushed the cross at her throat, a gesture Jake had come to know meant trouble was weighing heavy on her mind. As the local schoolteacher, she'd seen enough violence since coming west to know what was coming. The last time Tucker Kane's bunch had torn through a town, they'd left it burning like a funeral pyre against the big sky. "They say Kane's got 20 men riding with him now," she said, her blue eyes catching the dying light like water in a desert mirage. "Then it's gonna be a fair fight," Jake drawled, the ghost of a smile touching his sun-weathered face. "They're gonna need at least that many." The thunder of hooves grew louder, and Jake could make out individual riders now, their shapes dark against the horizon like birds of prey circling a dying thing. 6 months ago, he'd made a promise to his dying brother to track down Tucker Kane and make things right. Tom had died with Jake's hands pressed against the bullet hole in his chest, trying to hold his life in like water in cupped palms. "Get everyone into the church basement," Jake said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of having men's lives depending on his words. "Reverend Matthews knows what to do." Mary hesitated, her hand reaching out but stopping short of touching his arm. "What Tucker did to Tom, it ain't worth dying over, Jake." "Ain't about dying," Jake replied, checking his Colt one last time. The action was smooth as silk, maintained with the same careful attention he gave to everything that mattered. "It's about living right. About keeping promises." The first shots cracked across the valley like thunder, and Jake's paint horse didn't so much as twitch. She was battle-tested, like her rider, familiar with the song of gunfire and the smell of powder smoke. Jake had named her Grace, partly as a joke and partly because she moved like God's own blessing under saddle. "Mary," Jake said, not taking his eyes off the approaching riders, "remember what I told you about that package in my steel bag?" She nodded, her throat too tight for words. "If things go south, you make sure that gets to Marshal Wilson in Helena. He'll know what to do with it." The package contained enough evidence to hang Tucker Kane 10 times over, bank robberies, murders, and worse things that decent folks didn't speak of in daylight. The gang was close enough now that Jake could see Tucker Kane's silver-mounted saddle catching the last rays of sun like a signal mirror. The man had always been one for flash, even back when they'd all ridden together in the war. Before Tucker had shown his true colors, before he'd gunned down Tom in cold blood over a card game that should have ended in nothing worse than hurt pride and empty pockets. Jake's hands, those hands that could gentle a wild horse or split a playing card edge on at 20 paces, moved with fluid grace as he dismounted. Grace knew her job, backing away to the hitching post, without being told. A good horse was like that, reading your mind before you had to speak it. 20 men's a lot of lead flying, Mary said, her voice steady despite the fear Jake could smell coming off her like prairie sage after rain. "Reckon so," Jake agreed, rolling his shoulders to settle his gun belt just right. "But a man's word is like good steel, ain't no bending it once it's set." He turned to her then, really looked at her, taking in the way the dying light painted her hair the color of harvest wheat. "You best get to the church now, Mary. Ain't gonna be fit company out here for a lady in about 2 minutes." She backed away, but not before saying, "Your hands might be made for killing, Jake Hawkins, but your heart ain't. Remember that." The words hit him harder than any bullet ever had. Jake watched her go, thinking about hands and hearts and promises made in blood. His brother Tom had had the softest heart of any man Jake had ever known, could cry over a hurt bird or a sad song, but his hands had been hard as mountain stone when they needed to be. Maybe that's what made a real man, knowing when to be steel and when to be silk. Tucker Kane's voice boomed across the dusty street, full of false cheer and real menace. "Well, if it ain't the late Tom Hawkins' baby brother. Thought I might find you skulking around these parts." Jake didn't answer right away, just stood there in the street like he had all the time in the world. The evening wind tugged at his duster, and somewhere a door slammed shut as the last townspeople scurried to safety. He could feel 20 guns trained on him, 20 fingers itching on triggers, but his hands were steady as mountain peaks. "Tucker," he finally called back, "reckon you and me got some unfinished business to tend to." A laugh rolled across the space between them, ugly as a coyote's bark. "Business? Hell, boy, what happened to Tom was just bad luck at cards. Could have happened to anyone." "Funny thing about luck," Jake said, his voice carrying clear in the evening air. "Seems to favor them that stack the deck and shoot men in the back." The laughter died. Tucker Kane's face, already ugly as sin, twisted into something worse. "You always did talk too much, Jake. Just like your brother. Right up until that last bullet shut him up good and proper." Jake's right hand, the hand that had held his brother as he died, that had dug his grave in the hard Montana earth, twitched slightly. "Figure we can do this civil-like, Tucker. Just you and me. Or we can paint this whole street red. Your choice." More laughter from Tucker's men, but Jake noticed a few shifting uncomfortably in their saddles. His reputation wasn't just smoke and whiskey tales. They'd all heard what happened in Deadwood last spring, when 3 of Tucker's best had tried to ambush him. Jake had walked away, they hadn't. "Civil-like?" Tucker spat. "Ain't nothing civil about what's coming, boy. You rode 3 states looking for me, well, here I am. Hope you made your peace with whatever god you pray to." The sun had finally lost its grip on the world, leaving everything in that strange half-light where shadows had substance and distance was a liar. Jake's hands hung loose at his sides, close to his guns, but not touching them. He'd learned long ago that the difference between living and dying often came down to the space of a heartbeat. "Funny thing about peace," Jake said, his voice soft but carrying. "Some folks think it's about being gentle all the time. But sometimes peace is what you get after the storm's done its worst." His eyes, hard as winter ice, locked onto Tucker. "Tom knew that. Right before you shot him, he was trying to make peace. Offered to forget the whole thing, didn't he?" Something flickered across Tucker's face, maybe memory, maybe guilt, but probably just the dying light playing tricks. "Your brother was weak. Always was. Running his mouth about honor and fair play like we was still soldiers instead of men making our way in a hard world." Jake's fingers flexed, muscle memory from 1,000 practices making the movement smooth as silk. "Way I see it, Tucker, there's 2 kinds of men in this world. Ones that understand the difference between strength and cruelty, and ones that don't." Tom knew the difference. "My hands might be hard as steel, but they know when to be gentle. Yours just know how to hurt." The first shot came from the left. Jake had been expecting that, knowing Tucker's methods. His gun seemed to leap into his hands of their own accord, and the night erupted into fire and thunder. He moved like a dancer, each step calculated, each shot purposeful. His hands, those hands that could braid a girl's hair or splint a broken wing, dealt death with terrible precision. The street became a chaos of muzzle flashes and screaming horses. Jake's world narrowed to the space between heartbeats, where life and death played their eternal game. He felt bullets tug at his clothes, heard them sing past his ears like angry wasps, but his hands never wavered. 3 men fell, then 5, then more. Tucker's gang, used to preying on the weak, found themselves facing something else entirely, a man whose gentle hands had been forced to become instruments of justice. Jake moved through their fire like a ghost, each shot finding its mark with the inevitability of judgment. And then, through the smoke and chaos, Jake found himself facing Tucker Kane across 20 feet of blood-soaked dirt. Both men were bleeding, Jake from a graze along his ribs, Tucker from where a bullet had taken off part of his ear. "Shoulda stayed away, boy," Tucker wheezed, his gun hand trembling slightly. "Some things ain't meant to be made right." Jake's hands were steady as mountains. Tom believed different. Believed in mercy right up to the end. "Reckon I owe it to him to offer you the same thing he offered you that night." Tucker's laugh was more of a cough. "That so? And what's that?" "A chance to walk away. To find whatever peace you got left in you." Jake's voice was soft, like he was gentling a spooked horse. Tom would have wanted that. For a moment, something like uncertainty crossed Tucker's face. Then his gun came up, fast as a striking snake, but Jake's hands, those hands that could touch a hummingbird's wing without disturbing a feather, were faster. The single shot echoed off the buildings like final judgment. Tucker Kane looked surprised, then angry, then nothing at all as he folded to the ground. The silver-mounted saddle that had caught the sunset earlier now caught his blood, turning it black in the gathering dark. Jake holstered his guns with hands that were starting to shake, just a little. He could hear people emerging from the church basement, could hear Mary's voice calling his name. But for a moment, he just stood there, looking at his hands in the last of the light. They were still the same hands, strong enough to deal death, gentle enough to heal. His brother Tom had understood that, had lived it every day of his life. Maybe that was his real legacy, not the violence of his death, but the gentleness he'd carried through life. Mary reached him first, her fingers touching his arm like she was afraid he might break. "Jake?" He looked at her, really looked, seeing the concern in her eyes, the way the cross at her throat caught the last light like a star fallen to earth. His hands, those hands that had just dealt so much death, gentled as he reached out to touch her cheek. "Some things," he said softly, "are worth being gentle for." The moon was rising now, turning the blood in the street to black shadows and the bodies to silent lumps of darkness. Tomorrow, there would be graves to dig and stories to tell. But for now, Jake Hawkins stood in the gathering night, his hands, strong as steel, soft as mercy, finally at rest. In the distance, a hummingbird darted through the evening air, its wings catching the last light like tiny mirrors, unafraid of the violence that had just played out below. Jake watched it go, thinking about his brother Tom, about Tucker Kane, about hands that could kill and hands that could heal. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of sage and gunsmoke across the valley. Somewhere in the darkness, his paint horse nickered softly, and Jake felt the weight of the badge in his pocket, the U.S. Marshal star he'd been carrying in secret all these months, waiting for this moment. "Reckon Tom would be proud," Mary said, her hand finding his. Jake looked down at their intertwined fingers, his calloused and powder-burned, hers smooth and clean. "Reckon he would," he agreed. "Man's hands tell his story," Pa used to say. "Just hope mine tell the right one." As the stars began to appear, like silver bullet holes in heaven's dark hide, Jake Hawkins led Mary Bennett away from the battlefield that had once been Main Street. His hands, those hands that could break a man or mend a heart, held hers like they were holding something precious and wild and free. Behind them, the town of Copper Creek settled into an uneasy peace, while ahead, the Montana night spread out like a promise waiting to be kept. Jake thought about hands then, hands that worked and hands that killed, hands that healed and hands that held on tight to what mattered. In the end, maybe that's what separated the good men from the bad, not the strength in their hands, but the wisdom to know when to use it. His brother Tom had known that, had died knowing it, and now Jake would live knowing it too. The gentle steel of a true cowboy's hands wasn't in their strength or their skill with a gun, it was in knowing when to be strong and when to be gentle, when to fight and when to heal. As Jake rode out of Copper Creek the next morning, with Mary by his side and his marshal's badge finally pinned to his chest in the light of day, he understood at last what his pa had meant about a cowboy's hands. They weren't just tools for working or weapons for fighting, they were instruments of choice, capable of both destruction and creation, violence and tenderness. And in that balance, in that choice between steel and silk, lay the true measure of a man's worth. The hummingbird returned at dawn, dancing through the morning light like a living jewel, unafraid of the hands that had dealt death the night before. Jake watched it go, smiling slightly, knowing that his hands, like his heart, would always know the difference between strength and cruelty, between justice and revenge. That, in the end, was what made a true cowboy's hands as remarkable as they were, not their strength or their gentleness alone, but the wisdom to know when to use each. And as Jake Hawkins rode into his future, he carried that wisdom with him, branded into his heart as surely as his brother's memory was branded into his soul. If you are enjoying the Western Echoes, Cowboy Tales Unleashed channel, hit the subscribe button for future post.